Okay, hi everyone. I'm Luis Pessoa, and this is the Neuroscience and Philosophy Salon. We get together once in a while to discuss really cool papers at the intersection between neuroscience and philosophy or conceptual issues. And I'm really excited today to be discussing something that a lot of us care care about along many dimensions, actually. They're spanning all the way from causation to what the spikes do in the brain, what oscillations do in the brain, what LFPs do in the brain. So today we're going to be having a discussion of a paper that is, I think so far, I think it's just in bioRxiv. I presume that it's in the review process. The paper is called Decoupling Measurements and Processes on the Epiphenomenon Debate Surrounding Brain Oscillations and Field Potentials, and is a paper by Sander van Bree, Dan Levenstein, Matthew Krause, Bradley Wojtek, and Richard Gao. And what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to introduce them in a second. I'm admitting people here that show up in the waiting room. So what we're going to do today is, again, just a reminder, the way we run this is with a format that really has in mind us engaging in as active debate, as much as an active debate as possible as we can with this, with via in a Zoom setting. So we ask the people leading the discussion to present their paper or their talk or whatever material they want to share with us in something around half an hour or so. So that's what we're going to do. And then we follow up with a completely open discussion from everyone. Everyone is welcome to participate. There's no order about, I'm trying to recognize there's nothing about seniority here or anything like that. It's completely open. So I'll try my best to moderate as well as I can. So if I once in a while I miss a raised hand or someone trying to participate, please just open your mic and just say, I would like to say something so I can give you a chance. So let me introduce the speakers, the presenters, the discussants. I think that I think it's really worth spending a minute or so going over a little bit more of the way they themselves introduced themselves in the text that they sent me, because I think it really speaks to the format that we're trying to engage in here and really bring together neuroscience with an angle that welcomes and embraces conceptual investigation, and not as just a kind of on the side musings, but something that can really inform the way we do our science and hopefully even actually improve our science. So let me read here, and I think that speaks to that desire. So Sander van Bree is currently a postdoc at the University of Gießen, working with Martin Hebert on visual representations in the macaque brain. During his PhD, he developed analytical methods to facilitate the study of brain dynamics in cognitive neuroscience. But before his PhD, he performed research on the causal role of oscillations toward functions such as visual awareness and speech processing. Sander is interested in the philosophy of neuroscience and scientific explanation more generally. So I think Sander is going to be the main presenter today after a few words from Richard. But the second author, the second discussant is Dan Levenstein, who did his PhD with Buzzacchi and John Rinzel at New York University, and now is a postdoc with Blake Richards and Adrian Peyrash at McGill University. His work focuses on the use of offline or spontaneous activity to support learning in biological and artificial neural networks. And he uses biologically inspired neural network models, neural data analysis, and works closely with experimental collaborators. He also has a strong interest in the philosophy of science, especially in the use of computational models in neuroscience and how mechanistic and normative approaches can work together to understand neurosystems. Matt Krause is a research scientist at the Montreal Neurological Institute, the famous MNI, at McGill University with Chris Pack. He was originally trained as a linguist and computer scientist not far from where I am right now at Georgetown, before doing a PhD in neuroscience at Yale, where he used recordings from large animal models, macaques, to study how visual information is represented and processed to guide behavior. He continues to be interested in vision, but is now 8 years into a quote unquote quick side project investigating how weak electric fields like those produced during transcranial electrical stimulation affect neuronal activity. So he concludes by saying that it turned out that the side project turned out to be more interesting and complicated than he had imagined. And Richard Gao is currently a postdoc at Jacob Mackey's group at the Tübingen AI Center in Germany, and he obtained his PhD with Brad Wojtek at the Department of Cognitive Science at University of California, San Diego. He works on neural signal processing and data analysis, as well as machine learning for neuroscience and computational models of neurodynamics. He's really enjoying on this year's NBA playoffs and apparently likes to rant about oscillations and their epiphenomenalism in his spare time. Okay, that would be interesting. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Richard, and I think Richard is going to give some initial remarks and then pass on the baton to Sander. Please, Richard, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Louis. And thanks for inviting us to be here. I think based on the intro everyone wrote for themselves, it's pretty appropriate that I'm the opener for Sander, who will give the actual talk for the paper. And I'll just really quickly say a few words about how this kind of project started, because I think it's kind of fun out of this like community interaction. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, Lucy, you're gonna have to let me share my screen. Okay.
Yes, it's showing, yeah.
You guys can see it and hear me well?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Yeah, so like I said, I'll just very quickly take probably less than 5 minutes to introduce this work. So, you know, you guys all know what the title of the paper is, but like sort of my blurb is going to be about how one grad student's blog post rant turned into a serious academic paper through Twitter, Google Docs, Zoom, and the power of friendship, because I don't think I've ever met Sander in person, nor Matt. I've had a coffee with Dan, kind of chatting about this project, but like just hanging out. So all of this is a super online collaboration that everyone put a lot of effort into. And just a very quick history of how this happened. So 1924, the discovery of alpha waves was made in EEG. 2014, I became a grad student with Brad Wojtek, who couldn't be here today because it's his morning in San Diego, so he says hi to everyone. And in between those 90 years, there were a lot of research about brain oscillations, right? I think most of us, if not all of us that are here today, are here because we care about brain oscillations and LFPs and EEGs. So when I started my PhD, I was getting like very contradictory vibes from the people that I were talking to, because I was sort of in both cognitive and systems neuroscience. So from the cognitive people and the people that record oscillations in EEG, it seems like oscillations do stuff. And from the systems neuroscience people that record spikes, it seems like oscillations and LFPs don't do stuff. And it was very, very confusing to navigate this as an intro grad students, right? And so the asterisk here is to denote not all people think this. Some of the sort of most vocal champions of oscillations, like, for example, Earl Miller, are people that do systems neuroscience and record spikes. Nevertheless, it was sometimes discouraging, but very often confusing. And then in 2019, I was still a grad student, but just a lot more opinionated because you're like a fourth, fifth year grad student. And somebody on Twitter one day said something like LFPs are the exhaust fumes of cortical computation. This was really like in my head the triggering point for the reason why I'm here today, and probably the rest of you as well. And so I was very unhappy about this because this is sort of the 17th or nth time this debate has happened on Twitter. Never mind like sort of me having this in-person conversation with a lot of people over the course of these like 3 to 5 years. So I wrote this blog post, right? I just blurted it out one morning. And I thought that was going to be that until a couple of years later, 2022, this is like October or so, happened again on Twitter. Just another huge discussion about epiphenomenon, oscillations, spikes. Do LFPs do stuff? Do spikes do stuff? Do oscillations mean anything? And Dan had sort of, reposted this, tagged me, and tagged this blog post that I'd written. So at that point, I thought, I'm tired of this. Should we just make this a paper? And I don't really have it in me to do this myself. So really, this is how it started, right? Like I just sent this out on Twitter, and then what happened was a few other people decided to join. And I really want to think of myself as Braveheart here and leading the charge, but that's really more Sanders' role throughout this whole project. And I think maybe I'm the horse, maybe. And then 2024, there's a preprint, right? So now we're super happy because now this is out in the real world and it's getting community engagement and people are reading it. And I hope, liking it. And this is how far we've come since our first Zoom call and like Google Doc edits and all this stuff, right? So why am I telling you all of this? I mean, I'm having a good time reminiscing about this, especially now we have a paper, but there are 3 actual things I want to convey here, which sets up for the actual presentation of the paper. So one, in my experience, people really seem to enjoy this debate, or at least they want to have this debate. And it happens every couple of months, 6 to 18 months, right? And actually, this exact Zoom room 18 months ago held a very similar session on this topic exactly, which actually all 4 of us had attended. And it was kind of inspiring to see how much people cared about this and how like fiercely people debated this point, but at the same time, what the arguments that were being thrown is, right? So on this point, number 1, if there are editors out there, just make a note that maybe it will get cited a lot if this paper gets published. So related to that, the second point is there are a lot of good empirical arguments on both sides about this topic. And these are, I think, really productive conversations, but they're at the same time really confusing talking points about what epiphenomena and causality means in this whole system. And so that's the thing that we try to sort of disentangle so that later on, when we have this conversation repeatedly, until the day we all die, probably, we're going to have it on the side of empirical arguments because at the end of the day, science. So, just as a very brief spoiler alert, I guess, this is the part about decoupling measurements and processes, right? So, and the last thing is, this paper is very different from the blog post that I written, and it's because of the people that have contributed to this, namely the 4 others here. And also just having talked to a lot of people throughout this process, and then hopefully through this engagement, like today, we'll get to hear some critical and hopefully positive opinions about this paper and improve it. So with that, I will give you Xander to actually tell you about this paper.
Excellent. Thank you. Xander, please.
All right. Share my screen. Okay, so thanks, Luis. Thanks very much for the invitation and in general, your efforts in this salon. It's really great. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. So, okay, so I'm just gonna run you through the paper in about 30 minutes, namely the key points. There's more in there, but I just want to get the basic stuff out of there. So as Richard said, this is kind of the question that we're after here, whether oscillations and field potentials are epiphenomenal. And our strategy really is to kind of disentangle it and divide it up into parts and hopefully make it more empirically tractable, because at the end of the day, we have to answer it using data. So maybe it's also helpful if I briefly describe field potentials to people who are interested in this topic, but maybe haven't really worked on it or something like that. So we distinguish 3 levels at which field potentials can be acquired. You can record them locally. This typically involves using some sort of micro wire that you stick into the brain, and then outside of cells, you can record the field potential. And then as you move up towards the global scale, this typically involves placing, for example, electrodes on the scalp, and then some of the electric fields will emanate and you pick them up on the scalp, or you can pick up the magnetic fields that come with that. And what distinguishes these field potentials is basically how many sources or dipoles in technical terms underpin the actual recordings. So on the right, you get very global signals that capture large networks, but there's also going to be a lot of solutions to your signal, so to say. Now, if you look at these dynamics, these field potentials carry a lot of dynamical components, so to say. And a key one for our purposes are oscillations, which are these rhythmic fluctuations in the LFP that you can sometimes see with the naked eye. Sometimes you have to do some filtering. And these are really the key point, the key dynamical component that's of interest for us today, although we'll also look at some other dynamical components. And just also to probe or to prime the discussion here, actually you can see that different brain regions tend to display different frequencies, the human brain, that is. Okay, so now it's important to point out that over the years, over the decades, or perhaps even a century, increasingly so, these oscillations have been starting to be seen as active phenomena. So it's not just that you pick them up and then there's some sort of correlation that you derive. Increasingly, people have been starting to use causal words and casting them as active phenomena. So in other words, the oscillations are actually presumed to do causal work, and they are invoked in theories of cognition in the brain. So here are 3 key examples. A pretty old one is consciousness. There's this idea that you have different assemblies that carry different information, such as perceptual information, and then oscillations are summoned kind of as a theoretical entity to bind these representations together, and then you get a coherent percept. Another example is audition, where you have, this is a hypothesis, important to emphasize, where you have oscillators in the brain, and speech, because speech is quite rhythmic. The oscillators respond preferentially to the speech, and they allow the brain to kind of filter in a self-organized manner relevant information. Another prominent example is memory, where you have different representations kind of clocked across the theta cycle, across different phases of the theta cycle, different place-based representations activating in succession. Okay, so now we'll turn to our paper, and the first part is about conceptual clarification, and the second part is about empirical verification. And so conceptually speaking, we thought it would be helpful to disentangle the question of whether oscillations are epiphenomenal into sub-branches based on all sorts of theoretical entities that we thought are kind of important in this discussion. So a key distinction that we want to start off making is between the field potential and the electric field. The field potential is a measurement that captures the electric field, and the electric field is a process. And then you also have other processes which are involved in theory formation and in scientific explanation. And what is the difference between a measurement and a process? Well, a measurement basically gives you, we use it synonymously with things like signal or recording, and it basically allows you to draw inferences about processes. So measurements are not used to do theoretical work. They rather give you insights. They reduce your uncertainty about the state of physical processes which are actually doing the work. And that ties into the second distinction, the second axis, so to say, by which we can think about these entities and this question, we can analyze the causal relationship between these different entities. How is the field potential causally produced? And I think the way to think about causality here is basically if you take any of these components, such as the electric field, and you keep everything else constant, right? And then you change only that one dimension, what else is going to change? That's roughly how we view causality here. And inference is it's more epistemic. It's more about drawing inferences about physical processes. So if I have the field potential and possible dynamical states within that, what do I know about what's happening in the electric field in spiking inside of cells or outside of cells and on a behavioral level? So there could be many causal pathways that underpin that inference, but the point is you can make predictions about the physical state of the brain and the cognitive agent. Now, importantly, oscillations are kind of how we view it anyway, and of course we're going to discuss this. They can instantiate, so to say, in any of these entities. So you can have one in the field potential without there being one in the electric field or vice versa. But oscillations are just a general encompassing phenomena that can instantiate in one of these entities, we think. And now what I just want to do really quickly is to zoom through the most key relationships in this framework. So first, the relationship between the electric field and field potential is rather straightforward. The field potential is derived using electrodes. The electrodes are put into the brain or on the scalp. And you need a kind of a central electrode here, but you also need a reference electrode to get some sort of neutral anchoring point by which you can understand voltage changes. And it very much depends on there being electric fields, whether you're going to find these patterns in your field potential. So this causal relationship is rather straightforward, although it's by no means perfect. It depends where you place the electrode, for example. And even then, there are multiple solutions to the same field potential. Next, I want to turn to the relationship between electric fields and neurobiological processes. So I should say with neurobiological processes, we mean basically lots of stuff on the neural level. So most characteristically, something like action potentials, but synaptic turnover, but also even genetic processes in principle are part of this entity. So what is the relationship, the causal relationship between these two? Well, first, uncontroversially, the electric field is produced by neurobiological processes. When there are masses of action potentials, what result from that are electric fields. But there are also slower patterns, such as more longer scale calcium fluctuations that change the distribution of ions in the brain, that thus also change the electric field, which in turn change the field potential. And it's not just about the generation of electric fields, it's also about, causal factor is also about sculpting and shaping. So, if you have axons and neurons that are bent one way versus another, the ions that make up the electric field are going to look differently as a function of the morphology of neurons and also the conductance of tissue. This is very much a causal influence also. Now let's talk about the causal arrow in the other direction. So this one is particularly central, we think, because this asks whether electric fields influence neurobiological processes. And we think that there is reason to believe this. It's not conclusive, but it ties into the hypothesis of epiphenomenon coupling. And there are a few ways to test this. This is by no means exhaustive, but there are some ways in which you can do it. You can induce electric fields artificially, experimentally, and you can do so in vitro by just having a slice of the brain, and then in a well-controlled fashion, you measure the electric fields, and then you apply some sort of current, local current, and then you look very carefully what happens across neurons, for example. Another approach, which is a bit more diffuse, is to use electric stimulation across larger patches of cortex in vivo. So you can, for example, there's this method called the transcranial current stimulation, which involves the application of a current to the scalp, and some of that electricity will basically shunt its way through the cranium and into underlying neuronal populations. And then you just have to measure inside of those populations, and then you have to contrast the condition in which the electric stimulation is on. In this case, it's an alternating current. It can also be a direct current. And then you contrast it with a condition in which the stimulation is off, or at least ramped down. And then you look what the firing of neurons is, and then if you find that neurons fire much more, structurally in the stimulation condition, you can draw an inference that at least experimental fields have a causal effect on neurobiological processes. The limitation of this method is that you're kind of interfering with the endogenous fields. And that's, at the end of the day, what we're interested in. I mean, we're theorizing that when there are no experimenters in the room and there are no electrodes in our brain, at that point, we are assuming and theorizing that electric fields play some sort of role. So one way to do it is to model and simulate the endogenous fields. So you measure very carefully what the organic fields of the brain look like. And then you basically build two mathematical models, one in which is the default, where you have neurons that wire up and they exchange information. And from that, an electric field emanates, and that's it. And then you have a second model in which you also have a causal arrow going back. You include mathematical parameters that also make sure that the electric field that emerges changes the neurons. Then you've got your two models, and then you use real data of behavior or of EEG or whatever, and then you see which predicts better what the actual data is going to behave like, and then you can change your credence into effective coupling. And there's some interesting work on this. Finally, I mean, the ideal situation is if you attain endogenous control, where you gain direct control of the natural fields. This is a little bit tricky, but there are some interesting developments on that genetically and pharmacologically speaking. Okay, so next, let's turn to behavior. So I think one of the advantages of the framework that we propose is that it allows us to think more clearly about, I guess, the scope and limits of electric fields towards specific processes, right? So, it's perfectly conceivable that electric fields influence spiking and influence neurons, but that being insufficient to actually induce a behavioral or cognitive effect. So that's a further question. It's a further empirical question. And it's a bit tricky because there's a lot of stuff happening in this field of research when you apply stimulation. But the experimental logic goes a little bit like this. In an experimental setting, you apply some sort of brain stimulation, and then you assume and sometimes measure that there is a change in the experimentally induced fields. And then you measure if there is a significant difference in cognition. And then the inference that's sort of drawn is that when there's a change in endogenous fields, so again, when there are no experimenters in the room, that is of the same kind and nature as the experimental change, then we will also expect there to be a change in cognition. So for example, you might stimulate it at an alpha frequency, then you find a change in cognition, and then you draw the inference that when there are natural changes in alpha power, for example, you're also going to see changes in cognition. And there's an interesting inference train, and we discuss in the paper potential flaws with that inference train. Okay, so now let's turn to inferential relevance. So this is another dimension of our framework, which concerns, again, how much we can learn about the state of physical processes based on a measurement, in this case, the field potential. And basically, we want to say that assuming that all the previous points, the previous causal assumptions and causal hypotheses that we've raised, even if they don't work, even if, putting it bluntly, even if oscillations do nothing, it could still very well be that the oscillations, as you measure them in the field potential, grant you lots of information about different states and different physical states in the brain. And indeed, there's been a lot of work that leverages the field potential, either local or global or mesoscale, to draw inferences about physiological states. And this can be the balance of excitatory and inhibitory processes inside a cell and outside of a cell. Interestingly, you also have when you have a correspondence between or correlation between certain circuit configurations and oscillatory dynamics. So when you have certain neurons that are wired up in such and such a way, you tend to get different frequencies than as you would get for different wirings. And so I do emphasize that this is a reverse inference, right? So you can get for example, the gamma power from the LFP, and then you can try to get an inference about the circuit state. More macroscopically, you can try to tease out the excitatory inhibitory balance of patches of the brain based on the 1 over frequency, or the aperiodic component in the field potential. More on this in a minute. And finally, different cortical layers exert different frequency footprints on the field potential, presumably again because of circuit architecture, or either locally or up or downstream. Different frequencies suggest that you're measuring from different layers. Now let's move on to the inferential relevance of the field potential towards behavior and cognition and information processing. This is where things get quite interesting, I think. So you can use field potentials, the various components that are embedded within field potentials, to draw inferences about cognitive states. So one example is the event-related potential, which is basically a neural response in the brain following some striking event. It can be something hitting the sensorium, or it can be some sort of internal event like a surprise or a prediction error. And this creates some neural response. And if you average across lots of trials, you get some sort of index of that. And you can try to find correlations between, for example, the strength of the ERP and some cognitive variable, and actually start to draw inferences about subpersonal processes that are happening inside someone's brain. The 1 over frequency component is basically the part of the frequency spectrum that does not have to do directly with oscillations. And there are different components to the aperiodic component, namely you can talk about the exponent, you can talk about the offset, and these variables have different correlations to different cognitive processes and behavioral states. Now you can also just do a bit more of a scattershot approach, and you can take your field potential and just feed it in some sort of classifier. It can be a linear classifier, it can be a neural network. And you can try to make predictions based on on what's happening in your channels as to what, for example, the participant is thinking about, what they are remembering, in which spots in the space they are paying attention to. Or what I think is a particularly interesting example is that you can glean internal decision-making variables that are, I would argue, pretty hard to tease out experimentally on a psychological level. So basically, you can really get subpersonal here, and I think that's really interesting. Okay, so just going to speed up here a little bit, because now I want to talk about oscillations. And basically, the picture that we want to draw is that you can have oscillations in each of these entities that we just described. Here are some examples on the neurobiological level. You can have rhythmic cascades of neurotransmitter release, but you can also just talk about it on a purely behavioral level. In principle, you can have rhythmic fluctuations in the detection rate with which you perceive a stimulus. Again, using the process and measurement distinction, I think it becomes a bit more clear to think about signal detection terms about actually finding an oscillation and what it means to have detected an oscillation. So one problem is that on the signal level, not everything that looks like an oscillation really is generated by an oscillation in process. So one example is harmonics of true oscillations. When you have a perfect sinusoid, just like a sine wave, you have a very sharp peak in your frequency spectrum. But when you don't have when you have non-sinusoidal rhythms, you get these interesting harmonics at double the carrier frequency and triple the carrier frequency. And they're going to look like real oscillations, but they actually aren't. And you really want to make sure that you tease those out. Another example, as mentioned before, is the 1 over frequency component. It's a real technical and analytical challenge to disentangle genuine oscillations from 1 over F or 1 over frequency parts of the signal. Another challenge, and this one is also quite interesting, I think, is to verify whether if you even have, even if you have a rhythmic pattern in process, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're dealing with an oscillation. Because you can imagine lots of circumstances in which you get a rhythmic response in the brain from non-oscillation based mechanisms. One example is if I just invite you to a lab and I present to you at a steady rate a series of stimuli, be it music or visual. If I do that once a second and then I record from your brain, sheerly through passive mechanisms that are just processing all of those sounds, I'm going to detect a concatenation of the event-related potentials, but that's not a real oscillator. A real oscillator has additional properties that need to be teased out experimentally. One way to conceive of this difference is if I take a plastic bottle and I just start to wave it back and forth, the plastic bottle is not an oscillator, even though it's waving back and forth. What distinguishes a real oscillation is that it has kind of internal physical properties that cause it to behave in a self-sustained fashion like a pendulum. And if you're interested in how to figure out whether those criteria are met, we explain in the paper how you might do that. Just the last 2 or 3 slides here. Let's talk about effective coupling again, and in particular in the context of oscillations. So one point is that E-fields, some people think that E-fields are too weak to do anything. They can, they say, yeah, there are E-fields and, in principle, they could change action potentials, but they're just so weak, they're not going to do anything. Maybe, but there are some reasons to think that they do something, because we know from physics that if you have, in general, if you have a very weak additional drive across a large population of neurons, you can push systems over the edge, over a certain firing threshold. So on the left-hand side here, if you have neurons that just kind of act with noise, but then you've got this very slight oscillating E field riding on top of that, you might push the noise over the edge and cause neurons to fire where they otherwise wouldn't. Similarly, you can have a static E field that's not oscillating, and you can already have very weak rhythmic spiking regime being active that are sort of either undetectable or they might not do anything downstream. But now you've got this very slight additional push, this very small electric field that operates across many neurons at the same time. And now the rhythmic firing regime is able to exert causal consequences down the road. It's possible. Finally, I've been talking very much about oscillations and electrophysiological entities as kind of separate things and trying to decompose it into smaller parts. But there's another way to think about oscillation as a deeply integrated phenomenon. And it's kind of like, you can have rhythmic fluctuations inside the cell, in a circuit, in a network, but those are not really different things ontologically speaking. They're more like different levels of the same mechanism. So maybe it's also helpful to think about oscillations as kind of a multi-scale phenomenon. And people have done that. Here we try to kind of summarize 3 ways in which oscillations can exert such microscopic multi-scale effects. One way is by introducing a temporal syntax, a spatial syntax, or a frequency syntax. And basically what we mean by the word syntax, it's just a mode of information processing that facilitates the exchange of information between neurons. And I'm just gonna, for the sake of time, I'm just gonna skip over these, but we have some examples in the paper if you're interested. So that's basically it. I guess I would like to add that what we've done here is apply this framework to electrophysiology, but there's nothing stopping us from, or people from using this lens for other signals. You can use this for bold signals. You could use this for microscopy if you like. And so I guess the whole reason why this project came to be is that I think all of us felt that when you have 2 discussants, whether it's in a bar or in Lewis's podcast or wherever or in print even, if you have 2 parties and the 2 parties have different implicit background assumptions about what an oscillation is, one person might think of it deeply as physical and process-based, whereas the other person might think of it as a signal with undeterminately many processes underneath it, well, then you're just not going to agree because you start off with the wrong assumptions, and this risks an unproductive exchange. So that's the paper, and I look forward to discussion.
All right, thanks so much. That was exceedingly clear, as well as the paper. I have to say the paper is really, really excellent and well written. I really have to mention, because it really shows that you put an enormous effect of clarifying so many of these intertwined issues. Great. So let me open it up to any initial burning questions or clarifications that so if you can just, I hope it's enabled that you can just go in your settings there and raise your hand. Did I forget to enable that somehow? Can someone raise their hand just randomly? I'm not going to pick on you okay, so it is possible. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that that's possible. So yeah, so okay, so let me ask a question. I'm surprised that Conrad has not actually raised his hand to ask something about causation. So, oh yeah, there you go. See, I was the error signal was confirmed and disconfirmed almost simultaneously. So, Conrad, yes, please go ahead.
I mean, I don't think there's real disagreement here. No, like I was just starting to type about like shared reality. Like what are the things that we probably all definitely agree on? Like A, oscillations are there. B, oscillations are causally affected by like brain doing things. C, if you want, therefore, they provide some inferential information about things we might want to learn about brains. And I think we can also agree that there's clearly going to be causal influences of fields on neural activities. Like kind of like, I think there's no disagreement about any of those. And in that sense, kind of, I think I wanted to just maybe center here Atana's question, like how big's the effect gonna be? Like it's possible that basically the fields produced by oscillations provide absolutely infinitesimally small influences. Or it's possible a little bit like Earl Miller style, that they're like the ones like really doing the work. I personally come out hard on like it's probably a relatively weak effect, but like it feels like it's a quantitative question, not a philosophical question.
Well, actually, before you answer, I'd like to ask the panel. Do you agree with this? This is well. Let me say, I do think that you have a position there. It's very clear in the paper. But do you agree that in the field? I think that's an important question. That the field takes it to be along the lines that Conrad was phrasing, in the sense that it seems to me that a lot of people would be more dismissive than the weak version that Conrad is providing. Conrad is saying, okay, it's there, and yeah, it's electrical fields, and they will do something. We know via physics, we know that, but it's so weak that it's not gonna alter my cognition here, my behaving, my mental states, and so on. So I like to. I think it would be useful to clarify the panel's impression of the literature, actually, which I think would be valuable to everyone. I mean, to myself included. So what is people's takes? Just go forward. Don't have to introduce yourself. Just speak.
I'm just super excited that Conrad said this, because if every conversation about this topic moves forward from this question, I think we've done our jobs basically. And if your view is that like this is kind of obvious, which is like that would be super nice. But I think to Lewis's question, it's not everybody in this conversation at least at this point starts from that assumption that you have. So if we can make it an empirical question, I think, yeah, we're happy to basically call that a day.
Yeah, I think a lot of people round very weak effects then down to 0, or maybe in like specific sort of niche situations. Just to throw some numbers on it. So endogenous fields during slow wave oscillations are on the order of about 1 to 2 volts per meter. Sensory evoked oscillations just by sort of like a flickering stimuli, if you record in visual cortex, are maybe a quarter of that, a little bit weaker, according to some old data from Charlie Schroeder. And then the figure that Xander showed of a neuron is from one of our papers. And in that, it's not an endogenous field, it's an exogenous field, but it's about 0.3 volts per meter. And that is, it's the example neuron. It's the one where things work really well. But given that, it's hard to see how the effect could be near 0. Like it's not exactly apples to apples, but it does seem like the data is very more compelling than I think a lot of people imagine.
So if I understand you correctly, sorry, Conrad. So if you're pushing back on Conrad's point, essentially, right? You're saying that it's not so weak. I mean, it's quantitative, but it's quantitative that likely clearly matters.
I think the way that it could be weak is very different than what people imagine. So people just imagine that the endogenous field is not it's not strong enough to do anything because its strength is low. And then Conrad put in the chat, he could think just fine with a 9-volt battery held to my temple, which is true, right? The effects in non-invasive brain stimulation experiments are small, but they seem to sometimes be there. So our lab is involved in this giant multi-site replication where we're trying to get like a massive amount of data to really pin this down. And I think the aphaptic effects, if they exist, are going to be modulatory. They're not going to be huge. But a small effect distributed over a huge population can have a big impact on downstream things. Right, now Conrad has 2 questions.
Yeah, no, quick follow-up question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Matt, for the interpretation of the numbers that you just gave us, we need something to compare it to, and you can say, when I look at the membrane, it's gonna have like 50 millivolts over the membrane that is over a very, very short distance, or like alternatively, maybe the right size is like the length of the dendrite, which would be like, like 0.5 millimeter or something relative. So like, do you have a good way of putting those two like onto the same scale? I'm a little lost on it.
Yeah, so that's exactly how you would do it, right? So volts per meter times basically the length of the somatodendritic axis gives you the direct effect on a neuron. So the direct effect from a TACS-like thing of about 1 volt per meter is well below 1 millivolt of VM. But it seems to get amplified by sort of local network interactions because it's hitting a lot of neurons at the same time. So yeah, I don't know what to say beyond that.
And but it would be further amplified if it's rhythmic, right? I mean, like if an exogenous external one, if it's rhythmic, right? And if depending on obviously phase relationships, but because you're saying
more than that.
Okay.
So it's funny if you look at sort of the literature on non-neuronal oscillations. You can take an ongoing oscillation in like a jet turbine or a pipe organ or something, and you perturb it even very weakly with something similar, and all sorts of weird things happen. So I have hunted up and down YouTube to find an illustration of this, but Lord Raleigh wrote in like the 1920s about you have a pipe organ, you blow air through one tube, and then you have some air leaking into the adjacent pipe organ pipe, and it somehow quenches the oscillation so that you don't hear any sound. Which seems like there should be a nice video of it, but I haven't been able to find one. But there's all kinds of effects like that where a weak perturbation can do something. So I think if I could, one more thing, then I should stop talking. But like, so effect is kind of a weaselly word here because I think people imagine that the effect is, or people often imagine that the effect is like we're going to drive the neurons to do more of the same thing. So we have activity A that's coming in through the synapse, there's effect B. So then the neuron should act more like B. But it's some function of A and B, and it's not always very obvious what that should be.
In other words, you're saying that it's a little more than, or it should be viewed as more than just modulatory. Is that a correct interpretation of what you just said? Because
no, I think modulatory covers it, but modulatory doesn't necessarily mean just an increase or decrease at the same frequency, right? You could imagine it shifting phase relations. It could decrease the frequency, even though you're
Right.
adding something.
Right, but typically a lot of people would use the word modulatory informally, right? Or if you give the exact equation that you mean, that's different. Obviously, you can define it as whatever you want, but typically people would informally think of it as just kind of like some gain up and down of the same thing, right? I'm here doing this, I'm here doing this, right? So I didn't change what I'm doing, right? Because I thought Sander actually, did I get this wrong? Mentioned something about modulatory, but maybe I misheard or something that, okay, so got that wrong. Yeah, okay, good. That's good. Yeah, so before I give it to other people, let me get Dan to chime in.
Yeah, so I do want to first echo Matt's point that like the contribution is going to be different for different oscillations, right? It's not a case that like oscillations in the E field have this effect on neural tissue and that's uniform across the brain in every situation. Each oscillation is going to have a different generating mechanism that's going to cause a different magnitude of strength of the field, and neurons are maybe going to be in different susceptibility to the field due to, say, the collective action of different neurons. That being said, I think this is kind of where the terminology clarification is important for the paper, because I think the question of are oscillations in general epiphenomenal is a bit of a different question from the one of the E field, right? The oscillation is more than just the fluctuations in the E field, is kind of an emergent organization of neural tissue. And you could be completely agnostic to the degree to which the E field contributes to the generation of the oscillation, and still think that these temporal dynamics are important for the computation, right? In which case the oscillation is not an epiphenomenon. It's causally important for the brain doing whatever it's doing in that situation. And we just happen to have the E field to measure that. And I think this might be where I'm a little bit different from the other co-authors, in that, like, as far as I'm concerned, the question of the E field is almost irrelevant to the question of if oscillations matter to the brain.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, if there anything that is immediately following up on this, I'll take that. But if not, I will give Alexei, please, please.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. It was really interesting. I especially liked your slides showing that when you observe something at a macro level, you do not know if it's a true oscillation, because we're doing aggregation spatially and temporally, and they could be coming from different ensembles, and it may not be the same curve. So I wanted to ask your thoughts on, Hawken and Kelso and Tagnoli, they shift focus from an oscillator to coupling between various oscillators, because then you just mentioned mass action, right? And they talk about the strength of coupling and weakness of coupling. And so really the events related to the interaction of many oscillators at the same time, such as metastability, multistability, and things like that, versus just looking at one oscillator. I mean, what are your thoughts on that level of analysis?
I would invite the entire panel, whoever wants to take on answers and questions, please just jump ahead. I mean, really.
I mean, yeah, I think that's pretty much the right way to think about it. I mean, you can ask what one oscillating circuit does, or you can think about oscillations as a complex interlocking set of processes. And also in the paper, we discussed some ways in which multiple frequencies actually interact. So it's not just about narrowing in the causal role of, let's say, alpha oscillations. Another way to think about it is that you actually have cross-frequency coupling. You have different oscillators carrying different information, and that actually gives you some sort of synergistic computation and extra causal powers, potentially. Yeah, so I totally agree.
I do think we should be careful about equating neural oscillations with individual oscillatory units, right? I think especially the way it's used in the, in the neural literature, like it doesn't necessarily need to be a single limit cycle. You can think of things like ringing as also, counting as neural oscillations, or even resonance. you know, and these kind of phenomena really do emerge in complex systems whenever you have feedback loops. Like it's hard to wire up a system with feedback loops and not getting some kind of resonance or limit cycle that emerges.
All right, thanks. Tony, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks so much. So I have actually 3 questions, and because I'm also a quite early and I guess like not so well informed PhD students, like these questions more err on the philosophical side. But I think I'll just ask all of them at once, just in case they get lost in the discussion, then we can talk about them if that's okay. Yeah, so the first question is about when we talk about whether the brain is under effect of like electrical field, and then we could, let's say, artificially generate electrical field and see if there is a measurable response to that. And my question for that is I mean, I have nothing about like the whole experiment set up and everything, but how I interpreted that is that it only means that the brain can generate a response to artificially generated electric field. That doesn't mean that the brain actually does, right? And so that's my first question. What do you think about that? And the second question is kind of, every time I think about, you know, kind of like oscillation effect in the brain itself is, I get more like a chicken and egg problem type of thing, you know, because like the oscillation is not something external being imposed onto it, it's something self-generated, and then this is something self-generated but also self-affecting itself. But then like, don't you get stuck in this infinite loop of, you know, cause and effect? And I mean, we just talked about like effect size before, you know, like is it like the 10% of effect, so you know after 2 loops there's practically nothing going on, or is it more like, you know, like something else? Okay, so that's second question. The third question is that I mean, if I look at people like Earl Miller, who kind of talks about, hey, like each oscillatory rhythm or frequency band is I guess like associated with like a different type of activity, right? Is it like top down, bottom up, kind of like the beta and gamma segregation, for example? And my question for that is that, you know, there are very different tasks that belong to the same type that your brain does. And I mean, and you obviously know that the specifics of the task that you're doing, right? So if, let's say, a rhythm is carrying the information of, oh, this is like this task type, how does it, like, how does the rest of your brain encode the other specific of the task, so that you don't, you know, like do one task and all of a sudden you switch over to doing another task? And, you know, and also like if oscillation is something that affects this globally, how do you make sure to, you know, not have the effect, you know, like going into each other's pathways and stuff? So yeah, thanks.
Any comments? Any?
I guess on the first question, yeah, this is something that so maybe as I understood your first question, you're saying, well, okay, you apply external electric field to the brain, and then maybe you see something, but that's really not ultimately what we're thinking about. We want to know whether the fields as they are generated by the brain do work. That was your first question, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that that's true, and I think that this is maybe a bit of something overseen in, at least in the field of brain stimulation, is like when you apply some sort of stimulation method, are the causal mechanisms by which you exert an effect the same as those mechanisms by which the natural brain leverages electric fields to produce similar effects? Are you postulating that it works via effective coupling? Are you invoking spikes? Are the spatial temporal dynamics of the fields the same? What is the intensity comparison? These things are sometimes left by the wayside, but the similarity between the variables in the natural brain and the experimental brain should be similar enough to warrant that inference. So that, yeah, I share your concern there, I think.
I think I would slightly disagree with the Sander there. Like I can imagine ways that it's possible for an exogenous field to act differently than an endogenous, but given the data that's there, I think the safe starting point has to be that the endogenous field and exogenous fields are similar, at least as long as you start matching them along the right dimensions. Like at some level, the neuron doesn't know where charge is coming from. It just knows that there's charge building up on its membrane. And given that, how could the charge not have an effect? Now, it could be the case that like the charge is different in some way. Like, so people always go to the intensity argument, but I think that's not necessarily it. It may be the scale. So endogenous electric fields could be sort of distributed differently than exogenous ones that sort of could maybe take advantage of the structure of the local network to sort of amplify themselves. They could be lined up wrong, right? So you need the field to not only be strong, but be along the major axis of the neuron so that it can have a big effect. But yeah, I think just the starting point probably ought to be, given that, like, if you made this argument with glutamate, I think people would find it kind of silly. You said, well, this extra glutamate causes the neuron to spike. How do we know that endogenous glutamate causes it to spike? And I don't know. I never heard anyone make that argument in terms of chemicals.
Well, here's one example. So I'm interested in like rhythmic transcranial magnetic stimulation, and that's really like quite different. Like as I understand it, when you apply a transcranial magnetic pulse, you are inducing action potentials actually, and then you can apply the TMS rhythmically at some rate, at 10 hertz, so to say. And then I'm not sure if it's warranted to draw the inference that when you apply 10 hertz TMS and you find some cognitive effect, whether you can translate that to alpha oscillations without specification of how those are similar and different. Seem to be different things.
Yeah, that's what I mean by scale, though. The TMS is really walloping the hell out of everything at the target, right? So, yeah. I mean, people draw these very focal field maps, but if you actually have the color bar go all the way to 0, you'd see that a huge part of the brain is being stimulated, and it's being stimulated super thresholdly, above threshold. so there, I think it's not nearly as well aligned. And yeah, and also, right, the alpha rhythm is not 10 hertz. It drifts from within a person over a scale of minutes. It drifts across people over your lifespan. Drugs, caffeine, task, all mess with it. So I think the higher level stuff is very difficult to translate back and forth. But at the level of charge piling up and causing a depolarization or hyperpolarization, to me, it's got to be pretty similar, or you've got to suggest sort of a mechanism by which it's not. You being the generic you, not just you, Sander.
Okay. Tony, was there anything that you wanted to, because I know you had several items there, but is there any follow-up that you wanted to make sure that you got addressed, second or third questions, or?
I mean, I think for now we talked about basically like the first question, and that part I think it's pretty clear for me for now. Yo.
I can maybe get a little bit of the second question, which was the question of like, how do you deal with the fact of circular causality and amplification in oscillations? And I think, the answer is that basically that is by definition when oscillations emerge, specifically because you have circular causality, you have, some process affecting another, which has a feedback loop to the original process. And so we see that, in either in computational models or with manipulations in the brain, that usually when we get oscillations are specifically when we have those kind of systems wired up like that. The question of how the brain deals with that to avoid, say, oscillations that blow up, that's an interesting question, but I don't think I don't think that's necessarily a problem for the oscillations question, because we know that's exactly what causes oscillations in the first place.
Right, even if those oscillations are at the same level, right? Like say, like just spiking neurons that are interconnected, right? So they will, yeah, I mean, just
Sure.
by the nature
Yeah, I
of
mean,
that.
like the classical gamma models are basically an inhibitory and an excitatory cell that are mutually, synaptic, right? And obviously what's happening in the brain is more complicated than that, but it's very easy to get simple neuron models to oscillate.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Conrad. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you had a something related to this, or are you waiting for some? Okay. All right. So I'll put you on the queue for a second. So Tony, before we get to your third question, let me do the following. Let me go to Jorge here, and then we circle back if there's time, so that we get a chance. So Jorge, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the very interesting presentation. I have a question because I want to understand the effect of this electric, the source of this electric charge. Because I understand. So I'm sorry if I am saying things that doesn't make a lot of sense. But I understand that oscillations, in some sense, is about clusters of neurons, many clusters working, activating and creating patterns of activity patterns. So when I think about like you applying a current, I imagine like you are like placing in the brain in that region like a fake cluster, a cluster that is pure is synthetic, and with this cluster you want to create influence the message of the whole, because oscillations are giving messages, I writing codes constantly, codes that are written in ensembles, for example. So basically something that could be done is to use this by using this technique of simulating this electrical activity. It is like you try to get into the language of the brain, the language of the code, the language of these spatial temporal patterns, and try to talk with the system, talk with the network. But I think that is really complex because it requires a lot of what is the code it is difficult to know what is the code. But my question is this could be something that could be done, is to try to use this excitation of currents to try to see if by tuning the temporal or spatial configuration, try to optimally affect the brain. I don't know if that makes sense. Sorry if does it make sense? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I would mention, and one of the other panelists can also jump in if I'm saying something stupid, is that I think most of the evidence we have at this point suggests that oscillations are providing more of a syntax than a semantics, right? It's not that the content of what's being represented is written in oscillations, though, some language people might disagree with me, but that it's more providing the spaces and the punctuation, not the content of the words, for example. So I don't think that just through whatever our temporal fluctuations are, the oscillations that we're putting in artificially, that we're going to be able to write content into the brain, for example, or read content out. It's more that it provides structuring or organization that then groups of neurons can use to represent content.
Okay.
I think
I think I would agree. Like the radio is actually a really nice example of this, right? So when you turn your radio to like 101.3 megahertz, like the music is not coming in at 101.3 megahertz. It's carried in some modulation on top of that. And spiking, I think most people would agree, works the same way. So the oscillations coordinate the spikes so that information can flow. And when you try to manipulate the oscillations, your goal is often not to write like a new piece of semantic information, like your name or something. It's to allow something to route that appropriately instead.
And I think a great example here from the physiology is that like the hippocampal theta oscillation, which I would say is, the rodent hippocampal theta oscillation is probably one of the best understood we have, at least from the physiology. And we have a really good sense that what it's doing is basically chunking information from representing the present in early theta to representing possible futures in late theta. And so, right, the content of like, where am I is not in the phase of theta, but it's in which neurons are active at which phase.
That's actually a really interesting way of putting it, but at the same time, it feels to me a fairly strong statement. So I'm curious. I mean, Matt already chimed in, and I wonder if Sander and Richard also have the same take. So essentially that it's much more syntactical than anything more semantic, which I mean, I guess it finally crystallized the way that Dan was saying it, and I was like, whoa, really? But I don't know, what do Sander and Richard also agree with that? Because I guess Matt already said, given all our experience with radios, that's pretty much on target. So
yeah, so I mean, I definitely agree with Dan's take, and actually looping back to one of your first questions, Luis, just my opinion of the literature is actually there are like two poles. There are people who work in neuroscience who basically don't think oscillations do anything, and they won't maybe use the word, or they won't even research it. And then there's the opposite pole, where you have people who are really embedded in the research program of oscillations as being a causal and computational entity. And at that end of the pole, you have people, this is of course for reasons of sociology and publication structure, but there's a lot of incentive to sneak in, not sneak in a deceptive way, but to use causal language that's unsupported and to imbue oscillations with representational capacities that they don't have, that there's no support that they have it. So in a sense, it's placing a homunculus in the oscillation that's not actually there. And I fully agree with Dan that it's a syntactical role and not a semantic representational, generating function that oscillations have.
thank you. That was amazing. Yeah. Richard, do you want to give your take as well?
Yeah, I would say I don't have a super strong opinion on this, but if I were to lean one way or the other, I would also say it's more about the syntax and the content. I think that just makes more sense to me, I guess, but eventually this is like an empirical question. I think if we move it in that realm, again, I would be super happy.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Okay, great. Conrad, your turn. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just to push on the empirical question. So for me, it's ultimately all of these are empirical questions. And I think like a slight problem that I have with the debate across all of neuroscience here is that it's taking it too much as if it was a theoretical question. Like in reality, all the things we're discussing have empirical answers. Like we say oscillations have a causal role. Well, we can make systems oscillate, and we can say, ask to which level does a current injection have different effects depending on in which phase we do it. We are doing decoding, and I think the reason why a lot of people aren't so into oscillations is like they're just not very useful features when doing decoding in most cases. But all those disagreements, I think, that I feel in the room, and I feel that the anti-oscillation crowd isn't like so much, at least the hardcore people of the anti-oscillation crowd aren't so much in the room here, that they're just like, give us experimental evidence of the usefulness of it. Give us causal experimental evidence for that. And that's just like very difficult. Like, how can you make neurons oscillate without also making them spike? Like there is the difficult causal problem there. But I think we'll need to face that if we want to make those kind of causal statements. And I think like there are great experiments to be done. And I very much hope that we're going to get more of those experiments.
I mean, from a naive perspective, it's not my area. And can these experiments be done, or is it very far? Like, it's like, what, are we 5 years away, 10 years away, or something like that? Like, for instance, I work with fMRI, and a really important finding was when spiking activity was blocked, and the bold signal the bold signal wasn't, right. So it was a hugely important finding to understand the link, but also that the nature of this link, and that experiment was a huge importance. So where are we in this general area?
So I think this is going to end up being a different answer for each oscillation, right? Different oscillations in the brain have different underlying generating mechanisms, and perform or don't perform different computational roles in the circuit that they're in. And I think this is a great place where, again, the hippocampal theta oscillation is maybe one of the few that we've been able to do this. Maybe Matt's going to yell at me, I don't know. But there's a case in which we've been able to, as directly as possible, manipulate the oscillatory dynamics without changing that much more about what's going on in the circuit, either through cooling. So there's a great cooling experiment from Peter Peterson, or from optogenetic manipulation of the upstream system that is triggering the production of the theta oscillation without messing up the representational properties of the hippocampus. And basically what you see is, if you opto inhibit the medial septum, you lose the theta oscillation in the hippocampus, but you still have place cells. But you lose their temporal structuring and kind of sequences from past to future. And the result is that you still have good decoding of place, but you lose the ability to produce replay in the future, right? So I think that's a pretty good causal evidence that this oscillation is doing something with learning sequences of activity that are then used to produce replay.
Right, to the extent that the conditions that the circuit is maintaining the same state, right? I mean, that way, obviously,
of course, and there's always,
experimentalists, we're always going to say, but if only you could exactly match, and so on and so forth, which such intertwining might make it, again, not being terribly knowledgeable here, but it seems like if there's a challenge is to make this, like I think that Sander started, one of the things that he started by saying was probably in the very first few slides, is that by understanding here, our understanding of causality is that we keep everything constant and see what happens, right? But it's easier said than done, right? In a system in which the physics is doing its thing. So yeah, okay. I lost my train of thought here, but I don't know where we are, or if we've come to a conclusion, or if there are any. Okay, Alvaro comes to the rescue. Alvaro has a question. Thank you.
Hello. First of all, thank you for the talk. It was extremely interesting. I have to apologize if my English is not good enough because I'm Spanish. I'm also a psychology student, so I'm not at your academic level. But one thought I had was about, I think a couple of times you mentioned the concept of circular causality. But I think that's kind of misleading, because it implies that an effect can be the cause of the first cause in the chain. Which I think cannot be the case, if I'm not mistaken, unless a very curved spacetime exists with closed time loops. So it is my opinion, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that it would be more helpful to talk about dynamic systems, period, not circular causality, because even when we think there's like a circular process, the new cause or the new effect is not the first one. It's just that they are very similar in a dynamical way. I don't know what you think about that.
Does anyone want to? I think yeah. Go ahead. Does anyone want to take this?
I would take this because I had this conversation with somebody. I think typically when people say circuit causality for this, the counterfactual or the alternative is that spikes generate oscillations, and it's like from a micro scale to a macro scale. And then because of that, then the macro scale cannot affect the micro scale. So the field or the oscillation the population oscillation cannot then affect the spikes. So, but I think that's the thing that we're kind of pushing back against, that indeed you can have this like bigger to smaller causality error. But what you're saying is that temporally, then that field causes future spikes, not the spikes that generated the field itself. That's absolutely true, right? That cannot be the case. So I think what people typically refer to, at least in this context, as circular causation is the spatial scale and not across time.
Yeah, I think also I would add, Alvaro, that that's a really good point, because sometimes we get a little bit lost in some discussions of causation and circular or whatever co-causation, losing the temporal dimension. And I think that bringing it to your point there that you're raising is a useful one to kind of to remember that there is a time evolution of the system, and you can maybe either speak of it if you want, but if you can maybe actually bypass speaking too explicitly by it, and just, for instance, model as coupled differential equations and understand the entire trajectory of your dynamical system and whatnot. So, but yeah, I think these are complex issues that I think that we would have a lot of opportunity for discussion, because there are many different views on these issues on causation, and whether true emergence could be synchronic, or it's always has a temporal unfolding component. So it's an enormous area of debate that intersects what this panel is addressing, which makes it even more challenging, but it's a little bit separate from it too. But Sander maybe can clarify, maybe has something that can put us on the right track.
Yeah, so two things. I think we're definitely sympathetic to a manifold perspective when the direction of causality and when chicken and egg problems are present. We have an interesting box in the paper where we think about what it means to think about neural oscillations across large networks from a dynamical systems perspective, and how that might tie in with neuronal computation. But at the same time, I do think you can actually get some grip on whether it's something as a one-way causal street or whether it's a feedback loop. You just have to build models that compare the two possibilities. You either, I discussed this briefly in the presentation, but you either model things such that you have electric fields emerging from neurobiological processes, and you include a model in which it feeds back, and then you can compare the two models. It's not like super hardcore causality or something like that, but I do think we can get a grip on such questions.
So one interesting way to tease them apart is that the ephaptic effects probably have a slightly different time scale than the synaptic transmission too. So the synaptic transmission is, all of this annoyingly depends on the specifics, right? But on the one hand, you're sort of limited by the conduction velocity of the neuron and the time for this stuff to diffuse. And the ephaptic effects are almost entirely diffusion driven, because you're looking at the movement of charged ions basically through the brain. So there's some stuff, I'm blanking on the name, it's in the paper, it's like something with a Q. Who looked at this? Xander knows the paper.
Well, I was thinking about HASP. HASP has an interesting paper on this, but I think you're talking about Q. Yeah, it's
like 2015. So I don't think that's really been explored a lot since, but that's one way to sort of tease apart, and also helps address your concern about things sort of time traveling.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. One of the things that I found most, I mean, a lot of things were incredibly informative, to be honest, but what Dan said, which is very sobering, but I think really, really so important, is it will be very case specific. And so it's not like this bold spike relationship, but it's going to be this relationship in this area, in this area, in this area, in this situation, and that, which I think makes makes it incredibly challenging for us as a community to not be speaking in circles here forever, because we might be taking examples out of context, and I think it's very sobering in a way that it will require a lot of clear communication and patience from all parties to do justice to this complexity, and not just jump, oh, they don't do anything, or it does everything, or it's syntax, it's semantics. It just seems almost like if Dan is correct, which it seems very sensible, it seems almost like a formula for misery in neuroscience for quite some time to come, given the opportunities for talking past each other along so many different axes of and Matt, you wanted to chime in, or go ahead? No,
I want to say something.
Okay, Sander then.
Yeah, I want to say there are definitely interesting attempts to bring order to the disorder you allude to. So, for example, interesting work by Saskia Hagens, for example, who, I mean, it's very interesting because you got these frequency bands, and I would also be interested to hear people's opinions about actually frequency bands and how they are carved up into frequency space and whether that maps onto nature in any kind of interesting way. Okay, maybe we can talk about that later. But you know, the fact of the matter is that there are such relationships. Alpha, for example, seems to be involved in attention in one way or another. Memory is often linked up with theta and so forth. But as many of you know, there's this interesting discussion between a brain-inspired neuroscience, where we kind of leave behind our psychological vocabulary and start with the brain, versus just sticking with the vocabulary we end up with. And so one very interesting idea from the bottom up, so to say, from the brain-inspired approach, is to think of alpha oscillations not as being linked up to one or another cognitive function, but to actually try to create some order and structure into this whole system by postulating general functions of alpha oscillations that transcend the specific cognitive modality that you're working on. So it could be that alpha is some sort of gives you some sort of filtering mechanism that is not just about attention. It can also be the case that that's relevant for visual decision making and other processes. So those are interesting attempts.
Yeah, I really like that perspective. I think that to the extent that I'm trying to remember now, because I listened I was listening to your paper a couple of times. I haven't read it like, but I did listen to it a couple of times. This aspect, if it hasn't been as highlighted, and if it's all the authors are in somewhat agreement, I think would be really valuable to highlight. I think that's something that really is coming across with the discussion here, that somehow it hadn't popped out as strongly when I engaged with the paper itself. But yeah. Okay, so I think we're kind of coming to the end of our discussion. I don't know if there are any final questions or clarifications that people have. If there aren't, so I don't know if it's can share. So this paper is, are we going to see this paper out sometime? So this paper has been submitted, I presume, or it's still in the process, going through the motions, or?
I hope some editor is going to see this and hurry up.
Okay. If only it was so this was so powerful, but yeah. But I hope you're right. Okay, everyone, thank you so much, and yeah, see everyone next time. Thank you, everyone. It was awesome. It was very
Thanks.
Excellent discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Louis.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, it's great.